Welcome everybody to tonight's program marking Ethics Week, sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Claire Regan. I am President-elect of SPJ. Our program tonight is marking Ethics Week, and it's sponsored by our committee called the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee. I am zooming in from New York City. I am a longtime journalist at the Staten Island Advance, and I teach at Wagner College. I'm happy to welcome our two panelists this evening. We have Rod Hicks and Duane Pohlman, who will be leading our discussions. Rod, can you introduce yourself to our guests, please?
Sure, Claire. Thank you. I'm Rod Hicks. I am the Director of Ethics and Diversity for SPJ. I've worked at SPJ for a little over 3 years now. I started there in a position called Journalist on Call, where my focus was on trust in the media and trying to talk to the public about why they don't trust the media, and talking to media companies about what the public is saying that they need to do. We really tried to educate the public about the media, hoping that if they had a better understanding, that they would see that we try really hard to get things right. Before I came to SPJ, I worked at several newspapers, and my last stop before here was the Associated Press, where I spent 9 years at the in the regional office of AP in the Northeast, serving 10 states. And the newspapers that I worked at include the Detroit Free Press, Detroit News, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and a couple other places in Alabama and New Jersey.
Thanks, Rod. SPJ is fortunate to have all your experience on board. Duane, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Claire and Rod. It's always an honor to be with you. I'm Duane Pohlman. I'm the chair of the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee, and we've been very busy, and we're proud of this Ethics Week. This is my 35th year as a professional journalist, and I've worked in a dozen stations across the country. I'm currently in Cincinnati at WKRC TV. I'm as a chief investigative reporter. I'm an investigative reporter nationally with a thing called Spotlight on America. And while I have a long background many years ago of being a student member, I've reattached with SPJ, and it's over its stand on ethics that draws me so near and dear to SPJ. And I'm so glad to be along and helping such wonderful people who are carrying the torch for journalism and ethics at the center of it. So I'm proud to be here, proud to help in any way I can, Claire.
Great to have you as well. Thanks to both of you. As your moderator, I just want to point out that if you have any comments or questions, especially, please put them in the chat. I'll be watching during our program for questions, and I'll bring them to our panelists. For now, I'd like to hand it back to Rod. He's going to take us on a tour of our Ethics Central website. We're eager to show you tonight all of the resources that SPJ offers about ethics and challenges in ethics.
Okay, thanks, Claire. We started the Ethics Central page on our website, where we pull together a lot of information about ethics and also diversity, because that's the other part that I do. In addition to ethics, my focus is also on diversity. And so if we have that web page, it is what we have at the top here is some stories that we go around the world. We bring in stories on topics that are current, dealing with ethics. There are a lot of places where you can go to find industry news, but there's not very many places where you can find news specifically about ethics and specifically about diversity in one spot. And so we have here, if you want to know what people are talking about related to ethics and diversity, this is really the place to go. If you look at some of the headlines here, we have the story about Taylor Lorenz, who's I think she's a technology columnist for the Washington Post. She was on MSNBC recently talking about online harassment and felt that the way that they conducted the interview brought more online harassment to her. If you go down a couple, this is one that I hear a lot of people talking about. Mick Mulvaney, who used to work in the Trump White House, is now going to work for CBS News. And the thing that we find interesting about his hiring is that CBS says that he's going to give them access to, people that they may not otherwise have access to. Presumably, they're talking about Republicans. But the concern is that during the time that Mulvaney was in the White House, he was one of the people who reinforced the lies of Donald Trump. He was involved in the call to the Ukrainian president, and he really bashed the press really harshly. You may recall that he blamed coverage of the coronavirus in the early stage as the Democrats trying to make Donald Trump look bad. Mind you, this was a new deadly disease that was really killing people at a pretty high rate there. And so this is the person that CBS has brought in. And so the question that we have is, who are these people that he's going to bring on? Is it going to be other people who were enablers of Donald Trump and his lies? Or is there really going to be some really reasonable discussion about issues that conservatives care about? We don't have to talk about all of them, but I did want to note Chris Wallace. There was one about Chris Wallace about why he left Fox News, which I found to be an interesting story. Not only do we have stories here, occasionally we will have some webinars that are coming up. There's one about Carl Zimmer, who's going, I think that's next week. He's going to speak. And so,
Rod, it's Claire. I just want to point out, this is a great resource for journalists and journalism educators that you're pulling from the web, significant stories about ethics. It's great.
Right, and we update it fairly frequently. Every couple of days you'll see new stories in there, and we do the same thing for diversity in the news as well. This is one about a correction. I find this to be a really good resource. Here's a story from this week. A woman who worked at WNYC, that's a public radio station in New York. She was accused of plagiarism, and then she left the station, but she is suing over. She said that she was harassed and she was discriminated and treated horribly. Her name is Jamie Floyd. You may know that there's been a lot of problems at WNYC in New York. Again, these are stories that people in our industry are talking about. And this is just a good place to go to find them, to know what's going on. And occasionally you'll see things that, I don't know if there's one in here, but there are surveys done by Pew Research, and there are some done by Gallup that focus on media and news, and they provide really invaluable information, insights into how news consumers are reacting to various things. So it's just a really rich in that type of information in here. The other thing that we do, here you see Sarah Palin. From time to time, when there's a big story that deals with either ethics or diversity, this one we put in the ethics category, we will write our own story. And here's one that I did after the verdict. You might know that Sarah Palin had sued the New York Times, and she did lose that case. But if there's an if there's a perspective that I think that we can provide that's not already out there, I'll write a story, or perhaps we'll find a freelancer to write a story. If you see the one that says Beyond the Zucker Headlines, Another Ethics Issue, this is a story, this is another story that I did. Again, you know the story about Chris Cuomo. If you click on that, you can see the story. Chris Cuomo and how Zucker was, it was just a lot of ethical issues going on there. And this was one that I thought that we could provide some context. I think this story focuses on how this whole thing started off wrong by Zucker endorsing Chris Cuomo in interviewing his brother, who at the time was the governor of New York. That was like the beginning of something that snowballed, and many other things happened. So that was one that we got, and we don't always focus on such heavy things. We will have a story coming up next week about the guest that we have here today. And there's a story in the pipeline about a young woman who for 20 something or about 20 years was a fashion writer. And after the pandemic and George Floyd and her adopting some kids, she thought she switched gears, and now she is writing a column on, much heavier and heavier issues, politics and culture and family is what she focuses on now. And there's a story there about a reporter wanted to tell indigenous stories. This is a woman who was in Arizona at a newspaper. There was no indigenous affairs beat. She created one, and it became very popular there. It was very appreciated by the community. She left that newspaper. She went to another newspaper, and she also started the same beat there. We just thought that was a very interesting feature. Again, that one deals with diversity. Of course, there's the Jason Blash story. One of our chapters had him on, and we just talked about his ethical crimes from 15 or 20 years ago, probably more like 20 years ago. That was an interesting discussion. When we move on, you see there just above resources, you can see the in-depth SPJ Code of Ethics. Every day on this page, we put one of the 35 bullets from the SPJ Code of Ethics. This one, be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable, give voice to the voiceless, is one of the bullets in our Code of Ethics. But along with that, if you click on that, what we've also done is taken the entire code and the 35 bullets of that code, and we have some suggestions at how you can use each bullet of the code to build trust. This was done for us by our partners at Trust in News. But that's the entire code, and the black type that you see there is a suggestion for how you can use this particular bullet from the code to bolster trust. And when we go back out to resources, the first one, sources of color, that is a diversity issue. If it's a forum that allows you to find diverse sources, so that all of your sources are not white men who generally dominate sources in news stories traditionally. The other one is the race and gender hotline. This is becoming very popular, actually. We get quite a few inquiries here, and it's really a great resource. If people have questions about race and gender and whether they are dealing with it with sensitivity, we have some editors who will address the questions, and the turnaround is really quick. we generally respond to questions in one day. You tell us how long, when your deadline is, and we will do our best to get you some answers. We don't always, we don't tell you what to do. We raise issues for you to consider. And in most cases, it becomes clear from the research that our team does what you should do. It's the same approach that we deal with ethics. Here you have the ethics hotline, and we get calls and emails. You can do it either way. If you click on that, you can see the options that you have to reach us. We take questions right now from journalists, from members of the public, and from students. And when you scroll down, there's an option for you to, where is it? Oh, you have to click on one of those buttons first. And then it tells you how to contact, and either through a phone number or you can shoot an email. And this is something that is used quite a bit also. People, journalists often have questions about ethics, and they will send us and ask questions about it. One that I got this week was from a woman who said that she was working on the story. I don't remember the details of the story, but it was about a woman who was in a very bad position financially. She needed help with something, and the journalist was covering that story, and she felt really bad for the woman, to the point that she wanted to help the woman. And she sent a question saying, if I give this woman $25 or $50, is that unethical?
Rod, quick question.
Yes.
Can those ethics questions be submitted anonymously, or do you need people to reveal who they are? I'm just wondering, from students, I see there's a link for students as well. I'm just wondering.
No, we need to know who you are.
Right.
However, we keep the information confidential. We don't share that with anybody. So that's one of the things that we do. And like I said, this is a good resource too.
Yeah, I'm glad we offer it for students as well.
Mm-hmm. And we are going to talk to a person from the public who sent us a question a little later. The Journalist Toolbox has a lot of information. Besides ethics, you'll see to the left that there are other topics that it deals with. But under ethics, it's just about everything. There's a link for SPJ Ethics Central, which is the page that we just left. It takes you back there. We have the code for the Society for News Design. We also have things like different special reports, and there's a guide for various types of issues that come up. There's one, I don't see it right now, that teaches you, gives you direction on how do you cover elections ethically. And this is something that stays on the page, so you can come back. There it is, campaign ethics, a field guide. And you see the accountable journalism. That is a collection of codes of ethics from around the world.
Fascinating to compare and contrast them.
Yes. The interesting thing about them is that they all have something in common. They're basically 4 broad areas that the codes of ethics address. And I haven't seen obviously all 400, but of the ones that I have studied, they all deal with, accountability, accuracy, fairness, the same sort of things that our code does. Just sort of minor differences. Some things focus on others, on one thing more than another. But you should take time and go through this, because this list is really rich, and it's something that has accumulated over the years. It's not, and the information stays there for the things that are timely, or rather things that might conceivably come up again. It's a very good resource there.
I just want to urge our audience tonight to check the chat because SPJ headquarters is including links to a lot of these pages for you.
Mhm. So that's a lot of what we're offering here, Claire.
Yeah, great tour. Thank you, Rod.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the tour to take us through. And in your role, you have really expanded the offerings, the ethics offerings on our website. Is that correct?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I think the main thing is us finding all these stories that keep people informed about the topical issues dealing with journalism ethics. And not only are these stories just interesting, it's something that you may actually find yourself involved in, something similar in your own career. So it's really good to see how some of these issues are, or some of these things may be blind spots that you have and you never thought that this was something that you would be faced with. So I just think it's really a good resource to just keep up to date and find out what issues are coming up that newsrooms are dealing with in case it ever comes your way.
No, I appreciate that as a journalism educator. I mean, it brings real time to ethics. It keeps it real and current. So thank you for compiling that. I'm going to go back to Duane now, a good segue. Duane, as chair of the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee, your members, me included, we're working on some special projects. You want to take us through a few of those?
Right. So we've there are a couple things in even what Rod pointed out. One of the issues that we're looking at is, again, the Code of Ethics. We think it's a fantastic document, no question about it, but we're going to have another look at that just to make sure that the language itself is up to date. I saw in the highlight that Rod had, for instance, give voice to the voiceless. It's been raised that may not be quite accurate on what we do, and it may be a bit paternalistic in its tone, more like give voice to those who aren't being heard or something like that. That's a little less arrogant, if you will. So we're going to be looking at the language on that and just making sure that we're keeping it timely. The last time it was revisited was 2014. In that era, and some with SPJ will remember, there were things like where we called it photographs, we moved it to images. So little tweaks like that, but we don't want to change any of the tone or tenor of what it addresses. We just want to modernize a little bit. And probably also, Claire, is one of the things on the plate that I'm looking at is perhaps making sure that we get the word out a little bit better so that people don't see ethics as so distant. A lot of what Rod is doing and what you've done, certainly Claire and many who have been with SPJ, is to reach out and not make it an esoteric exercise, but woven into the fabric of what journalists do. And that's what the ethics committee is going to look at. The other thing I'm looking at is that as you well know on the committee meetings is, should we be looking at a different term? It's an inside baseball, but I'll share it anyway, which is calling it a hotline may not represent exactly what we're trying to say. We're trying to be a resource. We don't want to, it's aspirational. SPJ Code of Ethics is aspirational. It's not a mandate. We're not the ethics police. So we want to be able to say that and say, if you have a problem, we want to work with you, as Rod alluded to, and he'll get to with his guest, is we want to at least give a language that says, hey, we want you to reach us because we want to be a partner and help you work through it. So, and as when Rod can't handle some of the flow of these stories for one reason or another, people who need questions answered, I do that as well. But it may not be, if the deadline on some of the things, because we're doing so much, the deadline may not be like, if you need it right now, I don't want it to sound like we're, operators are standing by. So we're looking at some of those parts and pieces and getting maybe a honing of the language that gives a better idea to people what we're doing. But I can tell you that we take it very seriously. when a journalist needs questions answered, and we do not exclude journalists who are not a member of SPJ. We provide this service to journalists and to the public who has questions, because ethics is for everyone, and to understand it and to partner. So there are a lot of things that are going to be moving next within just trying to make it a little more modern, up to date, and give the message a little better to everyone. And I just think that that's important, because ethics being the center of SPJ should not be in any way not connected in a daily fashion to what we do. That's what makes us separate and apart from other groups. We're the repository of something really important, and we're going to carry that banner forward. So that's what the ethics committee is going to do next, is take a look at those individual elements of the code, make sure that all the language is up to date, and then also look at the term hotline. These may sound like inside baseball, but it's really important on the outreach. So that's just some of it. And I think it's important, Rod, weigh in. We also previous, and Claire, you were there, part of this is we wanted to make sure that we had a process for tracking how these tips came in and how they were being dealt with. And because of that, Rod has made sure that we have a spreadsheet checking to see that everyone's getting. Can you speak to that a little bit, Rod?
Yeah, we just have for us, it's a form where when people come, we fill out the form, and it just lets us know who they are, what the question was, and most importantly, what do we do? What do we say? How is it addressed? And that's so if we ever need to refer back to that, we can. We still keep the information confidential, and it's usually not, any reason for us to go back. But should we ever need to, it's there.
And I think it's important to also point out, like, I'm dealing with a wonderful person in Pennsylvania, small town in Pennsylvania, that has serious questions and issues about one of their local papers. And it's an ongoing conversation in which that individual, this wonderful person, actually listened to the last seminar and said, it is so refreshing and so important to know that journalists are doing this. They had no idea. So just the idea that we care deeply about this is meanful, because that's really important. But also I applaud Rod for making sure that we adopted a very, it's not real rigorous, but a pretty good process now for saying, hey, what happened with X? So that we try not to forget any of the individuals. And I think it's a lot of work, but it's fantastic to have that kind of outreach. So I applaud you.
I wanted to just mention something about our code of ethics. I don't know if people know that many of the codes of ethics that news organizations use were based on the SPJ code. They use ours as a template. The other thing is, last summer, there were a couple of college professors who did a study of students who studied the code of ethics in school, which is a very common thing in college. The code is taught in some schools. And what their study found is that students who were familiar with the code did a better job at addressing ethical issues. They weren't like real ethical issues. I think they asked questions about how would you handle this, but the ones who did the best were those who had some exposure to the SPJ Code of Ethics. It's really something that is in this industry has been around for a while, and it is regarded as one of the best codes of ethics out there for journalists.
It certainly is the industry standard. I know it's usually our code of ethics, the SPJ code, is published in many journalism textbooks. The one I use in my class has the SPJ code.
Yeah,
So that is one of our signature items as SPJ. Yes.
Right. And occasionally it's cited in news shows,
Yeah,
in
exactly.
newspapers,
Yeah.
TV broadcasts.
And
But I think-
I want to commend you, Duane, just for leading the committee in keeping the code updated. I think that's really important to keep it relevant because, I mean, a good example to compare it to, an analogy, is maybe the Associated Press style book, which until the last issue was published every year. It's now every 2 years. But same situation where language and tone needs to be assessed and evaluated and updated, right?
Yeah, thank you. Listen, it's really cool to be, a lot of people tuck away ethics in a day-to-day fashion when they're so busy, but it really is crucial. By the way, President Rebecca Aguilar weighed in. She says it's time to update. So we got some good word there. Did you see the question from Don? Don said,
I was going to raise it. You can read it. Go ahead.
well, it's basically what he wants to know. Can you estimate the breakdown of national versus local journalists that consult SPJ on ethical issues? Is there any, that's off the top of your head because you don't have the list in front of you, Rod, but it's what I'm seeing is predominantly local issues. Is that your understanding?
I think it is. With ethics, it is. I think it's more half and half with the other forum that we have on race and gender. But yeah, I would say that it's mostly local.
Well, in my experience, it's been overwhelmingly questions about local issues, about their ownership, about direction. That's from journalists, about where things are they stepping over the line. And then with the general public, I think almost every person from the general public I've had contact with, it wasn't about like Fox News, CNN, and all that, which is what surprised me because I thought that would be the overwhelming amount. It's really, if it's any indication to me, it seems that they care deeply about their own communities, and that shouldn't really come as a surprise, should it? But about how things are covered locally.
Right.
Let me ask Rod, is there a category that a lot of the tips and questions that come into the hotline fall into? Is there an issue that many journalists come to us for?
Often it's about conflict of interest.
Mm.
I would say that that's probably the biggest category that we get. Yeah.
Yeah. The other part that really is important, and I think we need to drive home, is when I first assumed the chair of the committee, I started receiving these because we had a transition, so I had to deal with them. And of the four of the first dealings with journalists or public or managers who called or contacted us, they were looking for us to weigh in the midst of a very difficult situation, to, in other words, sanction something. That's not what we do. We were, by and large, that's a whole different process and usually on legal matters, bigger picture. But it's important that when we tell people you can get help from SPJ, that help isn't us to give a stamp of approval to one side or take one or the other side's point of view. This is about working with the journalism organization or general public to give guidance based on the code of ethics that they may not be familiar with. So that's really important on the expectation.
It looks like we've lost Rod for a moment. Let's hope he comes back in. In the meantime, Duane, I don't know if there's sort of an issue that we could explore, a real life story, real-time story, where we could apply the code of ethics to it and just show our audience how the code applies to stories. I mean, I think we could use conflict of interest. We could talk about Chris Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, that situation. Maybe you could just explain how the code of ethics could be the foundation for that kind of coverage.
So when you look at everything, and through the code of ethics, it's pretty simple to get a clear understanding. And I think you probably know that even better than me, Claire, is, the issue with the Cuomo relationship was not that there was a relationship. It was about the level of transparency about what was going on. And that's addressed in the code, which is if you're not honest with the public about your role, no one knew that Chris Cuomo was actually acting as an advisor de facto to his brother's campaign.
Right. He didn't divulge it. He was not transparent.
But the question also became what was divulged to CNN itself.
Mhm.
Should CNN have seen that? What are the levels of conflict? That's all in the code of ethics. And what was most surprising about situations like that and others is based on the SPJ Code of Ethics, it's integrated into their own system
Mhm.
at these organizations. So it was there, and CNN knew what a transgression would be. It was a mistake to overreach and get loose with it.
Mhm.
And then there's the issue of what did Chris say to them. I'm certain, there were points where he didn't say exactly what he was doing. So that all is addressed when you look through the lens. That's why the Code of Ethics is so cool, is that, if you're in doubt, which even after 35 years, and I'm sure Claire daily with you and what you do,
Mhm.
all you have to do is go back and take a look and say, so what part am I missing here?
Mhm.
I do investigative projects. I do long term. And one of the areas that I think was really important in the new set of codes was to minimize harm.
Mhm.
And the fact is that as an investigative reporter, I've been through a lot of variations of investigative reporting, which is sometimes referred loosely as in your face stuff. And, we've come a long way from what is kind of the titillation of the confrontation into true understanding, but you also putting it through the lens of the SPJ Code. Let's say, an investigative reporter would call and say, should I do the undercover? Should I do the confrontation? And I would say, first of all, have you tried everything else to get an answer? And are you doing it for effect, or is it something that's real that you need? And what's the outcome? What background information do you have about the stability of the individual? Do they have a situation? For instance, I'll give you an example. Years and years ago, one of the things that I covered, I was very young, I was in my 20s, and I confronted an individual at a housing authority in Raleigh, and he had dropped the ball on a very serious thing, which left a mother and her child dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. It just wasn't acted on. But what I didn't know is that his own wife was dying of cancer. So, you think about those things, and while it's not central and relevant to what happened in the outcome of the mother and son, it's important to know that. And was it something that, all these things need to be thought about, because what we do matters. The outcome of truth, it can be dangerous. Anyway, that's just a thought.
No, thank you for explaining that and taking us to your daily challenges in broadcast television. But I'm thinking about just the Ukraine-Russia war and the conflict there, and the struggle that many journalists are facing, the ethical challenge of using, not using graphic images. The images are coming across, for some, the threshold, it's crossing over the threshold of minimizing harm, telling the story or through these graphic images, or drawing a line about causing harm to viewers or relatives of the victims. So I think applying the minimize harm part of our code to those ethical judgment calls is really helpful. I know as a print journalist, I've faced those judgment calls myself. I'm wondering if you have faced any of those with graphic images as a broadcast journalist.
Oh yeah, we face it all the time. There was I'm trying to find the link, but we did a seminar on March 23rd with Eric Wishart.
That's right. Yep.
Yep, Eric is the AFP Standards and Ethics editor, and he gave a master class, and it was a really good one on how to evaluate graphic images. And quite frankly, it was about war coverage, but it applied to what we do here at home.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the graphic image is important. I think, Claire, you talked about things like the
Pohlman ban.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
graphic images have been an ethical challenge for journalists for centuries, going back to the Civil War, when corpses were photographed on the battlefields. We go back to that era, ever since photography. So we're still facing the same ethical decisions today with graphic images.
Well,
I would say
think-
also, I'm sorry, I would say also that, the code references not doing something for just for the sake of lyric
Yes.
curiosity.
Yes. What is your
you have-
journalistic purpose? I think.
Exactly. There has
right?
to be a journalistic purpose.
Yeah.
And you need to take into account how people will view these
Mhm.
and what their reaction would be. And also the dignity of the person photographed, depending on what the image is.
Exactly.
There's a lot of considerations that you
And
have to take.
is death a
Right.
private moment that should, the person doesn't have a choice about whether or not their private moment of death is being exposed. So a lot of things to take into consideration. And the
Well, I
code
don't-
can help.
Yeah, if I can add this, there was a moment, it came in 1990 with the US military. I covered the Gulf War I. I was in Saudi Arabia, Iraq. And the US military mandated no showing of bodies without permission of the military. I think that's an overreach. And I don't know if that still is standard practice. I assume it is.
Mhm.
But the fact is that while I don't like to see bodies on the air, I do believe that, when you talk about war is an awful, horrible exercise where people die. And sometimes if you cleanse it too much, and I'm just weighing that in. I'm not saying that there's a way to do this
Mhm.
that doesn't hopefully get into the kinds of things like identification. I would hate, you think about yourself, put yourself in that situation that you see a child of yours for the first time.
No.
And there's that, the one you referred to. It's just
The code helps us think about all the stakeholders involved in our ethical decisions. We have to take them all into consideration. I think it's.
Can I just quickly make
Oh,
one
yeah,
point?
go ahead,
about that?
Ron.
And I think that there is less tolerance for graphic photos if the images are of people who are local.
Yes, definitely
People
a
can handle
difference.
seeing
Mhm.
pictures from halfway across the world a lot more so than they can handle seeing images from their own communities.
A perfect example of that is a New York Times piece that was published on Wednesday, and I think headquarters can put that link into the chat for us, about a woman killed in Ukraine, and there's the link is in the chat there, who her face wasn't visible, but her nails, her hand was, and her manicure, and all of her friends and relatives recognized her corpse on the street because of her manicure. So you never know who's going to be traumatized and impacted by your decision to publish a photo. I think that's a good example. Yeah. I think I'm going to transition over to our guest, our other guest for tonight, Steve Schultz, and we're going to bring him in. And he's a good example of somebody who's gotten assistance from our ethics resources. And I'm going to ask Rod to introduce him. And Rod.
Sure. All right. Hi, Steve Schultz. How are you
He's
doing?
here.
Good
Hi,
evening.
Steve.
Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. First of all, why don't you just briefly introduce yourself, just briefly, so we know who we're talking to.
I've lived in Minneapolis for almost 30 years and have had a career in healthcare. And I have been an avid reader of the Star Tribune. I think it's a great newspaper. and through the years have submitted many op-eds that have been printed. And most recently, I submitted one in February that I think went a little sideways, and that's why we're here today. That's why I contacted the society here.
Okay, yes, Steve reached out to SPJ for to deal. We're going to an issue that he had with the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, the newspaper there. One of the things I'm curious about, Steve, before we get into your story, how did you know to reach out to us? How did you know? You're not a journalist, so how did you know?
I had seen your organization quoted in articles through the years. And so I did a little research, and I realized that you were a very respected organization, and I was very impressed with your code of ethics. And so I thought, as an organization who I thought dealt with accountability, that I trusted you with my story.
Okay, so again, briefly, just walk us through what happened, just as succinctly as you can, the issue that you brought to SPJ.
In early February, I wrote an op-ed regarding some of my concerns about living in Minneapolis. As you know, it's the home of George Floyd, and we've had protests and COVID. There have been a lot of challenges over the last couple of years. And in 2020, I moved my mom from Milwaukee to Minneapolis to live in the same building that I did. And she can live independently, but I thought living downtown close to the Mississippi, we could take walks in the afternoon, we could walk to restaurants, we could do a lot of things. In the 2 years, we couldn't do those things. And frankly, it was unsafe. My mom felt unsafe and I felt unsafe. And so basically, that was the gist of my op-ed.
So you wrote a story and the editors agreed to publish it. And the focus of it was why you and your mother are leaving Minneapolis. Okay. And so the newspaper, after they published it, they got it back in contact with you, right? And they said that they're going to attach a note to your story. Tell us.
Sure.
What they
I was notified on Thursday that it was going to be posted online Thursday evening, and it was. And it wasn't printed in the paper Friday morning. Late Friday morning, I received an email and said, "Are you the Stephen Schultz who has a criminal record?" And I said that I was. I had a conviction in 2014. And so I asked why they wanted to know that, because my op-ed had nothing to do with my crime. And they said we felt that we needed to put that as a introduction into your op-ed. I asked why. I didn't get a satisfactory answer why that had anything to do with my op-ed. And I was surprised that I wasn't told before they did that, and asked if perhaps I wanted to take my op-ed down. But anyway, finally on Saturday, after many requests, I asked that it be taken down. It was taken down, but it had been up there for about 24 hours with the introduction that Star Tribune put in.
Okay, and Steve, when you sent me an email, you actually cited our code of ethics because you thought that you had been wronged by the newspaper. Which of the bullet points did you cite from our code of ethics?
There were two. One was to minimize harm and to treat subjects, sources, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect. And I felt the fact that I didn't get an answer why they felt this was necessary to put in before my op-ed was causing me harm. And the second was that I thought that there was a violation of the code about concerning the long-term implications of the extended reach and permanence of publication. And attaching information about my crime just perpetuated my mistake from 9 years ago, something that I have served my time, and I am, for 4 years, I have had all my rights restored. And so I thought they didn't quite understand the permanence of just a little old resident of Minneapolis.
Okay, and your contention is that if you write a story about you and your mother moving out of town, that it is irrelevant for them to attach a note saying this is the same Steve Schultz who was convicted. And your crime was you were caught up in a police sting for soliciting a minor, correct?
Correct.
Right. And this is one where the person you were communicating with was actually a police officer and not a minor.
Correct.
But you got convicted of that crime and you served some time.
I did.
Right. Now, first of all, I want people to know that we did invite the Star Tribune to join us and they declined. However, they did answer some questions that I had for them. They said that the reason that they attached the note to your story was because of your crime. Apparently, in the text of your op-ed, one of the things that you cite several things. You talk about how the protests are going on in the area where you live. And first it was George Floyd, then it was Chauvin's trial, and then there were some other incidents that happened that there were protests. So that was one of the things. I can't remember. So what are some of the other things that caused you to leave?
There's been a lot of controversy about defunding the police. The police have lost almost 20% of their force over the last couple of years. Crime rates are up in the city. Carjackings are up. So it's just been a tough couple of years. And it's not the only city in America that's gone through this, but.
Okay, so you mentioned that crime is going up. This is the crux of their argument. They're saying that you are a criminal and you are talking about crime increasing. And so they felt that the context that you had a criminal record was relevant. But you obviously disagree with that.
Well, I do, because my crime did not hurt anybody. It was not violent. My crime, I take exception to the comment that people like me make Minneapolis unsafe. My crime was committed in a different city than Minneapolis. So that's why I take exception to that position.
It was in St. Paul, right?
Do you believe?
Go ahead, Rod. Duane, you go first, and I have a quick question too.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for doing this. It shows a lot of courage that you came forward to say all of these things, and I appreciate your honesty, because that's what it's all about. You own your mistake, and you said that they qualified it when they didn't have to because it was an unrelated subject matter. And from what I hear, the paper was saying, well, it was kind of related because of this. But what I want to ask you point blank is, by the characterization, do you believe that you were made separate from and apart as a class of like a sexual predator or whatever, that your opinion by stating that doesn't really count? Did you feel like you were dehumanized?
Oh, absolutely. And my big point is, when can I outlive this? Right? Because of the internet, my crime will be on the internet forever. And I thought, when it's so difficult to find a job with a criminal record and housing and all of those things, at what point, what do I have to do to be whole in the eyes of society again? Or am I just destined to constantly have that one mistake? And that is my only crime. That one mistake follow me to my grave. I just don't believe that makes for a healthy society, that people who have a criminal record are excluded from public conversation and public debate.
Steve, was the information, I'm just curious where it was placed. Was it an editor's note at the top of the story? So the reader had to read that first before reading your op-ed? I mean, there are always options in ethical decisions. The option was made, was chosen to include it, but even the placement of it, at the top or at the bottom, that matters when you're making a judgment call. And I think a lot of journalists can relate to this situation because we report on crimes all the time. And do you go back and do you recite the suspect's previous crimes or convictions in a story? Or is that relevant to the current crime, the current arrest. So I think journalists watching tonight can relate to that decision that they have to make.
And there have been many stories in the paper, news stories, not commentary, news stories about people. And they have been convicted of crimes, and there's never any qualification when their names are mentioned in an article. As an example, Adrian Peterson, who used to be a running back for the Minnesota Vikings, and he was convicted of beating his young child with a branch because that's how he was raised by his father. And so there have been many articles about him joining other teams and never mentioned the crime that he was.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. And when you were called by the newspaper and asked, and they were confirming your identity and your conviction, was it explained that that was going to be included with your op-ed? Were you told that it was going to be included, that information? Or did you just find out when it was published?
Well, for 24 hours, it was not included. In the Star Tribune,
Then it got added.
it got added, and
Okay.
they claimed because people had contacted them asking if
Oh,
I
I
was the
see.
same person. And this was done through email. There was no voice-to-voice communication.
Can I just add a little more context to that?
Yes, please.
The newspaper said that I asked if they had gone to you first and if they had asked you in advance before they attached the note, would they have not attached the note? And they said, we would have attached the note anyway because we consider it relevant and it's already out there, and we feel that, as long as it's out there, we need to put this note. And they said that that's why that they did not speak to you in advance, because regardless of what you said, the note would be attached. I also asked them, and I have it right here. My question was, in retrospect, is there anything you would have done differently regarding this matter? And by the way, this is, what's Mr. Gillespie's first name? This is the editorial page.
Scott Gillespie.
Scott Gillespie at the Star Tribune.
And I
He
believe
says
he's head of the editorial or the opinion
Right.
section of the Star Tribune.
Right. He said, with hindsight, we will have sought to include the relevant background information in the commentary when initially published. If Mr. Schultz had objected, we would have declined the piece.
That's good context to add.
Right.
Mhm.
So your position, Steve, was a couple of follow-ups. Your position was you were uncomfortable about the defunding of police, and you were stating that in part in your editorial input, right? That you were uncomfortable with the city that would defund the police. Am I hearing you right?
Is one of many things. And I didn't blame one thing or another. I said it's a very complicated issue, but just someone who lives here and chose to live here and brought their 88-year-old mother to live here too, things weren't working out.
Did you ever consider, there was a question from Rebecca, did you ever consider putting the editorial in, working in conjunction with your mother? In other words, not putting your name out there, knowing it might draw that attention?
I think she was asking, did you consider using your mother's name as the byline instead of your own?
I did not.
And what difference do you think it would have made, if any?
I don't think it would have made any difference. I was the one who wrote the article. She's the one who probably had different expectations than I did about moving there. I had lived there for 30 years, so I knew a little bit more of the context of what was going on, as opposed to her just moving there 2 years ago.
Right.
But I didn't want this. I didn't want her to be brought into this. And
So it sounds like you're
as you
saying
can
that,
imagine, there were 700 or 800 comments. A lot of them were very negative, and I expected that, and I didn't want my mother to be brought into that.
it sounds like you're saying too that her story about leaving Minneapolis is not your story, and that's. Am I understanding?
No, I would say it added to the equation. But when my mother would sit down and say, Steve, I don't feel safe going out for a walk at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was the one who encouraged her to move to Minneapolis during COVID because she was isolated in her home. I felt bad about that, but I had to agree with her. I said, 2 o'clock, I'm okay. I'm not sure I'm okay at 6 o'clock.
I just want to say two things here. I do think that the newspaper should have done its due diligence before the story went out. They actually covered your crime. I read the article that was in the Star Tribune of your conviction, so it's there. So learning about your crime will have been as simple as typing in your name into their archives. I also want to say, though, that I do believe that the fact that you have a criminal record, that there are other journalists and news organizations that will have made the same decision, because they see a tie between you complaining about crime, among other things, but complaining about crime, yet you have a criminal record. So I can see how some editors might see that that's relevant.
Yeah, I think
I understand that point of view, but again, mine was nonviolent. It didn't involve anybody. It was in another city. And I think this is just, as I alluded to earlier, it's a larger question. How long will this yoke of a mistake be around people's necks? And if more papers took the position of the Star Tribune, you're excluding a significant number of people who can participate in community dialogue through a newspaper.
well,
I
it
think
is
that would be a
true.
good op-ed for somebody to write, because you serve your time to society, you get convicted, and I don't think anybody deserves to have perpetual punishment.
If
Yeah,
I may,
Matthew,
this,
Matthew in the chat points out that felons, even those caught in stings who have committed no actual offense, lose their right to vote and to be on to serve on a jury.
But my
I don't think
rights
that's
have been
true.
restored because I have fulfilled my
You've-
sentence.
I
but
think
it's
that's
also,
it's by
also-
state. Some states have that.
State by
as well.
state, yeah.
but this is the actual crime that you're convicted of actually carries a different meaning in terms of the lasting power. And I think that's part of what Steve is talking about, which is when it's a sex crime or deemed to be part of that, you have the added burden. I assume you're on a registry of some kind, Steve? Yes, still?
I am, and for 10 years, and so that will be expiring shortly.
So the interesting part is this also is about how that is treated separate and apart from other crimes. And I think that's your point, Steve, right?
Yes. And frankly, there is a difference between abusing a kid, between child pornography, between abusing another human being, and what I did. Now, it all comes into a sex crime. I'm a convicted sex offender, but there are delineations within that I think are lost many times.
Right.
And if you look at some of the reforms that many states are going through, for instance, the right for felons to be able to vote and things like that, there are two exceptions, usually, sex offenders and violent crimes. And so it's like, okay, great. What can we do? How can we get out from under this yoke that news organizations and others? I mean, it's been a heck of a time to find a job, a heck of a time finding a place to live. And this is a crime that was committed 9 years ago.
I want to echo what Duane said, that I really appreciate your transparency, and I appreciate you letting us share your story, because you didn't have to do that. So thank you for that.
I have great respect for newspapers, for the media, and any little thing I can do to help you guys be better reporters in the community. I'm all for that. My mother was a journalism major, so the importance of a fair media and newspaper was hammered into us at a young age.
Well, thank you for your courage and transparency.
You're welcome.
We
Thank
really
you very much.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Just to wrap up our program, Steve, you're welcome to stay. Maybe Duane and Rod, final last words, parting words about how, Duane, your committee work is strengthening SPJ's ethics work, and Rod, and maybe what you want, what takeaways you would like our audience to have from your tour of the website. We'll start with Duane and then we'll go to Rod.
Well, I think if anything drives it home, and Steve, thank you for staying and talking, because it really was very important. At the end of the day, we cover human beings. And what we do matters in affecting change, and we do it for that reason. What we also do is we evaluate in a very meaningful way through the Code of Ethics, our responsibility to everyone involved in the story. People get hurt unintentionally, and sometimes we can avoid that if we evaluate exactly what we're doing. Steve's story kind of drives that home a little bit. I'm not faulting the newspaper, but I'm demonstrating that decisions that are made, and we have to make tough decisions on a daily basis, those decisions, when you put them through the lens of the Code of Ethics, which is multi-generational in terms of its understanding and development, that will allow the journalist to at least consider what they're doing and the effect of it, so that later on you say, gee, I wish I would have thought of that. We have it right here. So from the committee point of view, I promise you that we're going to be the best keepers of the best Code of Ethics in the world. And we're going to continue a strong effort in SPJ of being that repository and advocate for having ethics-centered reporting. And I have never been more proud of any one organization than this one, because it's a lot of talk on a lot of organizations, but this one, it's meaningful because we have great people like Claire, like Rod, like President Aguilar, John, who leads us as Executive Director, Schultz. We have so many great people that you don't even know about. Our staff is incredible, and everyone who gathers here is for one purpose, and that's to support great journalism that's ethical. And what a great, meaningful way to be. And so we're going to continue the conversation. Just so you know, too, we're approachable. If you have a problem, contact us. Just get a hold of us. We'll respond. And that makes us really, really important as well, because a lot of groups, as I've been a part of a lot of groups, takes forever. We will respond, and we do care. So thank you. We'll continue the work. If you have anything to add, contact us directly.
Yeah, our work on the committee, huge responsibility, but also a big privilege as well. Rod, parting words from your perspective.
You know, Claire, I know that you teach journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many years ago, I was an adjunct as well, and I taught intro to journalism, and I did it every fall, and did something different in the spring. And one of the things that I realized from doing that is that once a year, I got to go over the basics of journalism. I benefited from that just as much as those students. The significance of ethics weeks to me is that we like to think that we know how to act ethically when we are doing journalism. But it does not hurt to have a focus on that and a refresher every year. So that's the value that I see in having an ethics week. If you look across Twitter, you look at Facebook, you look at all of social media, we had these quotes from the ethics committee, from President Aguilar, and a couple other people, mostly committee members. And they were talking about the importance of ethics, journalism ethics, why it matters today. There have been, I don't know how many, but a lot of people saw those messages. A lot of journalists saw those messages. So even if they didn't attend this seminar, they didn't attend the seminar before, they got the words that, hey, here's a reminder that ethics is a very important thing. So I'm glad that we did Ethics Week. I'm glad that we put that out there just to remind people. But in addition to doing that, we did have some good conversations along the way. And I just look forward to working with you guys and continuing to try to get the public to understand what we do, people like Steve impressed me because he found us and he cited the SPJ Code of Ethics in his email to me. I'm impressed with that. And to say, if we cannot say that this is like everybody gets it, because every few weeks it seems there is something for us to talk about an ethical lapse in journalism. You know, Quill did this magazine last year that listed, I think it was about 9 or 10 of them, you know, and already this year there've been several. So there are these ethical lapses, and so that is proof that we need to keep promoting this and keep reminding journalists that this is how you need to perform. This is what the public deserves.
Agreed. Here, here. I mean, the code of ethics, our code of ethics applies to people beyond journalism. I mean, just human beings in general. It's very applicable to life. I want to thank Steve. Thank you for coming in tonight, joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for Duane and Rod for taking us on a tour of all the resources SPJ offers in the area of ethics. Thank you all for your insights and your contributions and your celebration of Ethics Week. Thank you to all for joining us tonight as well. And behind the scenes, Karen Sneath of SPJ headquarters has been helping out with the technology and sharing some links in the chat. So thank you to her as well. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.